Audio recordings of this podcast can be found on raisingequity.org and Raising Equity on YouTube.
Welcome to Raising Equity. In Raising Equity, we're always interested in understanding how systems operate, how they perpetuate inequities. But what about when we have to hold ourselves accountable for our institution perpetuating those inequities? How do we reconcile? What do we do in terms of reparations to repair the harm that we've done? It's a big question and one a lot of institutions are grappling with. And today I have with me Dr. Jonathan Smith, who's Vice President of Diversity and Community Engagement at St. Louis University. And he's going to share with us how St. Louis University is reckoning with its historical legacy. Thanks for joining me. Yeah. So we can talk maybe first about how, in general, we have seen a wave of particularly Jesuit and just older institutions in our country reckoning with their historical legacy of enslavement and slavery.
Right. So I think the first thing is to actually think about the fact that the wave isn't actually Jesuit. There's not yet a Jesuit wave.
Okay.
But we're in the era that's about it's about 20 years old. So Brown University was really the first institution that really started to grapple with this. And I think this was when Ruth Simmons was president of Brown around 2000.
Did she push that?
I think she did.
What was brewing?
So I think she pushed it, and it's just again one of those moments where people started to begin to realize where institutional money came from. And so just in terms of doing the long history of slavery, I think there are ways many of us who were taught about it were always taught about either enslaved people working in fields. We might have been taught about the Middle Passage, but I know when I was being educated about it, even when eons ago as an undergraduate, we talked very little about the economic structures of slavery, like who provided the money. So who was financing it and who made money off of it. So if you think about the way most of us think about slavery, we just really kind of focus on the Black bodies in the fields and their oppression. And that is just such a narrow view of slavery.
It fits within our Western individualistic mind.
Yes.
We think about the individuals, and I'm not minimizing the stories of enslaved people, right? But we think about the individual enslaved individuals. We think about the slave holders that we fail to see, like you said, the larger systems.
But we don't even think about the individuals. It's like, so we have these images in our mind.
They're caricatures.
Right? They're caricatures, right? So if you think about how do most of us envision Black bodies on slave ships, right? So when I give students of mine this task in class, and I really push them to identify, it's like, who is the person that appears in your mind? Almost invariably, it's someone who's a young adult male, able-bodied, virile individual.
Interesting.
And when you think about the millions of Africans who crossed the Atlantic, one of the things that I think I was deep into graduate school before I knew is that between a quarter and a third of the people who crossed the Atlantic were children.
I didn't know that many were children.
Yes. Between a quarter and a third were children. And they were judged to be children by their height. And so it's essentially like 4 feet 6 inches is about the height that was the demarcation height for children and adults.
About what age would that be? What do we estimate when we call them children, I guess?
Well, that's because we weren't keeping those records, so it's hard to know, right? So we know of specific individuals, like if you know about Phyllis Wheatley.
Mm-hmm.
And even though we know about Phyllis Wheatley, the image of the slave in a slave ship is still like Jaimin Hunsu in Amistad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Phyllis Wheatley came here on a ship called Phyllis when she was about 7 or 8 years old.
7 or 8?
Yes. And lived her life in Massachusetts. So we just have these images. We have these images and these caricatures of enslaved people, of slaveholders, of ships. And so we don't do the work that is both on either end, actually structural and systemic work, or work to recover individual lives and stories.
And like the richness of their stories.
And the richness of those stories.
So Brown, with President Simmons, started to ask the question, how are we complicit?
Right. And so and I think most of the projects heretofore have really been about how institutions have been complicit. And so in 2015, shortly after I became VP for Diversity and Community Engagement at St. Louis University, I had the task of working with the Clocktower Accords, which are, and remain deeply important to the work that I do. But from the beginning, I knew that I wanted to get the university involved in the work of figuring out what our history was with slavery and what we should do.
What do you say to people who say that was in the past, Jonathan, or, not just to you, but like, why dig that up? We're we're hundreds of years out. Why 400 years or 1619, right? Like,
because institutionally we believe in histories. We believe in memory, right? So St. Louis University has been around since 1818. And in 2018, we did, as an institution, we spent the entire year remembering the 200 years. And no one said, why are we remembering that? It's like, why don't we just be concerned about the courses that we're offering today and the services that we're offering today? No one said that we should not look back to commemorate, remember, uncover, analyze, celebrate, memorialize. So those questions don't get asked around so many other ways that we think about institutions, right?
Absolutely.
So for me, it was an important thing to do for a variety of reasons. So I love the way you framed it here, so that it's important for institutions to be accountable for past inequities. But I also thought that it's also one of those ways to be accountable is to actually find out what happened.
Yeah.
Right?
And to not just say we probably did something wrong and like hide your eyes and hope, right, that you don't dig up something too awful or not even dig it up,
or even to just focus on the people who did the awful stuff.
True.
Right. It's like why would we just? For me, a part of this work is removing the focus from them, because I think we're at a point in history. Nobody needs to prove to anybody that slavery was wrong, that it was heinous, that it was full of brutality, that there's no such thing as a good slaveholder. So those are, it's like, if we uncover anything like, here's an individual who was inhumane and brutalizing towards an enslaved person, there's absolutely nothing surprising about that. Except,
there's still people who are giving tours on plantations talking about those good masters and what a good life the enslaved people had.
So they talk about that. So even as they talk about that, there's still no one who's surprised.
Yes. You're right.
Yeah, there's no one who's going to be surprised that brutality and dehumanization existed in slavery.
Yeah.
So even when people have those narratives where everybody's happy about being enslaved,
right?
Even when they have those narratives, none of those people would ever dare say there was absolutely no brutality in slavery. They might try to talk about the exceptionality of where they're given the tour, but no one will say
that it was a happy institution.
Right.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
So there's absolutely nothing surprising about that.
Right. So why not also unearth the resilience, the vibrancy, the richness of the lives of people who were enslaved, because that humanizes them.
Yes, and fully humanizes them and gives us a much more full picture of whatever our histories are. However you want to parse our histories, whether you want to think about it institutionally, whether you want to think about it as a national history, global histories of individual races, however you want to parse it. And especially as an institution of higher education, knowing more is the thing that we are committed to do. It's like creating and unveiling and discovering new knowledge. That's what we're supposed to do.
That's what we're supposed to do. And it also, what I think is beautiful is that it complicates those caricatures that we're taught.
Yes, it does.
Right? Like
yes,
no
it does.
one is all bad or all good. And that's where I resist the binary in so many ways.
Yes. So to talk specifically about some things that we've discovered and uncovered from where we started this project. So about in 2015, when we started this project, we knew the first names of the first 6 enslaved people who came here, and that was all we knew. Which to me was just kind of stunning. Well, that was all we knew.
Well, how did you find out those names? Or maybe let's back up and talk about the project in general. So It's called the Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project.
And this is a thing that actually separates our project from other university projects. So I started this conversation with the president of the university as a university project. We discovered that simultaneously the central and southern province of the Society of Jesus were having those same conversations, and they're here in town. And so we came together to talk about how we might work on doing this project together. And so from the beginning, and there were a set of interesting conversations that involved the head of the province here, the president of the university, the archivist at the Jesuit archives here in St. Louis, myself, and other leaders from both institutions to figure out what our relationships should be, whether we should work together, whether we should work separately, what there was to gain, and even what to call the project. So everything here has involved some interesting kinds of conversations about how to talk about the project, what the aim of the project should be. But from the beginning, we decided to do this together because there's one important historical fact about St. Louis University and the Society of Jesus is that when the Jesuits came here in 1823 and brought those first 6 enslaved people with them, you couldn't separate the society from the university.
Because the university didn't exist.
Well, the university existed. It did? The university existed, but the enslaved people were owned by the society.
Okay.
And so that meant you might be doing work at the college or on the farm in Florissant, if you were enslaved, you weren't just working for the university.
Gotcha.
And so since those histories are intertwined it took a long while for the university and the society to really become separate, discrete institutions that we can recognize as having discrete kinds of property. But for the early stages of the history of the university and the society, you couldn't pull those apart.
Well, and you saying that makes me connect what we were talking about earlier, people who say, oh, why worry about this now? Well, it was their free labor that they were able to leverage to build what is. It's if we think about like a business loan or right, like that has to be repaid in some way.
Right. And so and then this labor exists. Every time we think about enslaved labor, we have to remember that it exists within a large economic structure.
Yes.
So even if you're owned by an individual or a discrete organization, you are still part of a large economy. So slavery never exists as a thing that's discreetly St. Louis University, discreetly the society, discreetly some bank downtown, discreetly some plantation owner. It's a global economic system. And so that's labor in the system. And whatever you did within that, whatever enslaved people did in that system did not affect only the institutions or the people who owned their bodies.
So it's like living in a capitalist society or a communist society. Your behavior within that is your behavior within that, but you're in the system.
Yes. And so for us now, when we talk about this project and we go out and talk in other places about it, we actually talk now about the importance of our joint project being a sign that slavery was the kind of institution that couldn't be limited to just the university. So if you're talking Brown University, the Browns who made that money were in all kinds of business, right? And their money's everywhere. And it's if the Browns, if that family is responsible, then how is it just the university?
That's a really, really important point that pushes us. Because I know working with organizations, they always are like, oh, I don't want to air my dirty laundry and have people protest me. Or, the wave of college campuses where provosts or presidents were being called to account, or buildings were wanting to be renamed. Like, people want something to point to and make it discrete. And what you're pushing us to realize is that, okay, you can point to some things, but this is a larger system. And that we have to really think about, like you said, that it's hard to have hard boundaries because it was the way our economy was structured at that time.
Right. And to think about it in those terms too, for me, it's important to think about this, to think about the recovery of the history of slavery and the recovery of the history of enslaved people. For me, it's like we have to stop thinking about that as dirty laundry.
Yes, I agree.
Right. If we discover and uncover the history of people who were enslaved, and we can talk about their lives, about how they responded to institutions, their culture, their descendants, their families. So where we've gone in the last few years, because our aim was first to do research to find out everything that we could find out. So instead of starting a very public project when we only had 6 first names, our goal and our aim was to do some research and find out everything we could before launching into something public. And I thought, because I am Black and descended from enslaved people, and I have a typical kind of ancestry problem, I get on Ancestry.com and go to the National Archives, do all of that, and I hit this 1870 wall.
Yes.
So I thought, we'll do about 6 months of research, we'll discover that all we know are these 6 names, and that's all we know.
Where did the 6 names come from, though?
From Jesuit records.
Okay, so the Jesuit records had them named.
Had them named, and so those names are out there. And I thought, if that's all that's out there now, it's like we're not going to find anything else. But instead, we found their surnames. We know how they were related. We know who those 3 families were. We know where they came from. We know about the next group that came in 1829 and those families. And we've been able in the last 3 years. It's taken us 3 years to get from those 6 surnames to actually being in a place where we can contact descendants.
That's amazing.
It's absolutely amazing. I thought that there would just be no way for us to find living descendants based on the information that we had. But because we've had this wonderful researcher, Kelly Schmidt, doing this work, looking at records that have been in English, Latin, Flemish, Spanish, French, and German that include board minutes, documents from the society, letters from visitors, letters from people who worked for the university, newspaper clippings and articles. We've been able to construct some really detailed histories of about 4 different families.
Okay.
And so we've just reached the point, and for us now, it's a wonderful point to be able to go public, because now we actually know some real stuff. Right. And so that we can talk not only about slavery at St. Louis University and with the society, but we can point to the names of specific people and their families and the relationships of property, right? So that now when we have these discussions, and for me, I think to get into the accountability, so where we want to go now as the university, on the university side of the project, is to start, we're launching a working group that will include faculty, staff, administration, board of trustees, some community representatives, and descendant representatives, to spend anywhere from 8 months to a year grappling with this information, launching conversations and dialogue to figure out what we should do. And for me, it's like, I think the important thing about accountability is that it needs to be figured out that way. And I've, in my role in this project, there have been moments I've really had to try to, put my personal preferences and my personal desires aside in service of wanting to have conversations for the community to figure out what to do. It's like, I do think in this case, it's fully inappropriate for the institution to decide in a unilateral way.
Interesting.
What to do about this.
And that's interesting because Georgetown University, I believe, came out, the students voted to have a fee.
Right.
So that would raise, I think it was the 272 enslaved people, they were going to have a $27.20 fee per semester, and that would generate some income. And I think the university, it sounds like they've rejected that at this point, and they said, we're going to put up the money.
Right.
And so that some of the conversation that I'm hearing is students and other people feeling like, well, but then that doesn't give us, the community doesn't give us any control or say. And it also allows us to put this behind us, so that some people were saying they liked the idea of the contribution because then it keeps the memory alive.
Yes, it's so really complicated. So the thing I'll say though first about Georgetown, and one of the things that we're modeling in terms of Georgetown, is they had a working group that spent a year with this information, with their information, and made a set of recommendations to the university, some of which the university took and some of which they didn't. And then it's after that process that there was student activism around it, which led to the student referendum for $27.20. And that would come out of student fees. And I have some personal feelings about that, but I'll leave those alone for the moment. Well, I don't want to go down that road quite yet. But it's like, I think the thing there that even with the activism, I think that the most important thing about that structure is that there is conversation. Right. So that there is conversation in terms of accountability, and that whatever the solution is, there are going to be people, I think, who are not good with it and people who are good with it. So Georgetown went through a variety of things. And I've tried to learn from their process, from best practices, and then waiting to have community conversation. Because one of the first things that Georgetown did unilaterally was to change the name of two buildings that were named after two of the two presidents who were involved in the sale of that group of 272. And so they renamed those halls, I think, something like Liberty and Freedom. And people got heated about it because they thought, now it's like these have never been Freedom and Liberty halls. And so that's a kind of erasure. And so for me, it's like, that's the point where you want to have community conversation.
Right.
I'm not averse to changing names of buildings. There are moments now, it's like, I think that's a conversation for community to have.
Right.
Do we change names of buildings, or do we rename new buildings? Or do we do something else? So there's a variety of things when you look at institutions and how they've held themselves accountable. Some institutions have changed names of buildings. Others have left the names of buildings the same and done different kinds of historical marking around it. Princeton Seminary just last week or 2 weeks ago.
Right.
I think they have a $27 million fund.
That was my understanding.
Yes, which is serious, right? It's serious. And some of that's going to be placed into scholarships and fellowships for seminary students, and some will be placed into the building of an academic program. And for me, it's like, all of those are really interesting kinds of things to do. And the question is, does real accountability mean you pay some fee, wipe your hands, and forget about it? Or does it mean you do some other thing? Right.
And I think what's interesting is you said Brown did this work 20 years ago. So there aren't very many best practices that you were really at a point where we're having to figure out, like you said, what works in this community to do this work. And it's happening at an interesting time because I think it's interesting. I'd like to hear your thoughts around the language. We're hearing a lot of talk around about reparations and the presidential debates.
Exactly.
Justin Hansford was just at the United Nations talking about reparations, as he has over many years. So there's all this talk about reparations, and yet the language in this program is reconciliation.
But again, that's just an important kind of difference between 2015 and 2019. It's like there was just absolutely no way to predict in 2015 that reparations would be a national conversation at the level of presidential candidates for the Democratic Party. That for me is just one of those occurrences that just surprised me.
Yeah. I actually was just thinking about this yesterday. I feel like there's been an acceleration of awareness that's happening in the mainstream. I mean, this is awareness. These are conversations that have been happening in all sorts of spaces, but not squarely on CNN or Fox or these mainstream channels. And so I think you're right. You could not have known that you could say reparations and you wouldn't be pelted with things to get off the stage and to stop. The people wouldn't shut down immediately.
Right. And so, and that for me, again, is just an important kind of difference between then and now, because I think when we had conversations about what to name this, we struggled around the language. We struggled around reconciliation. We struggled, whether or not that should be a part of it at all. And we were not unanimous. There were differing opinions.
And it's not to say that reparations cannot be a form of reconciliation.
Right. And for me, is we have to, the more we humanize the conversations and broaden them to get us to begin to fully realize that none of us exist in monolithic identity groups. I've talked to a number of Black people who are not interested in reconciliation at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's real.
And what does it mean to reconcile over a history of slavery? It's like, I'm not even sure I know what that means, right?
It's a tall task.
It's a tall task, but I'm also not sure I know what reparations means, right? Because I am not in favor of anything that will let people write a check and walk away.
Done with it. But it does feel like there's a common theme in what I've read about the different institutions, that there has been one form of reparations has been when they find descendants to have them, tuition free plus scholarships, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting response, right? So if you are an institution like Brown, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Georgetown, to some extent St. Louis University, the long arc of what has happened to Black people in terms of socioeconomics and education means that we're not looking at large segments of the population that will be eligible for those benefits.
And that's what gets me every time another college announces free tuition for families who make under whatever amount. It's like, so you want people to jump through every hurdle and be a superhero. And then
but that's why that for me is why those conversations have to be broad community conversations.
Gotcha.
And so that you can come up with solutions and responses that are appropriate and, for me, ideally and hopefully transformative kinds of responses, right? Because it's very easy to change the name of a building. And what happens to every building with the name, time passes, and 10 years from now, nobody knows who that person is. Nobody thinks about who DeBerg or Verhagen is. It's the name on a building, or a Dorjan, or pick a name.
Right.
At some point, in the first few moments, everybody knows who that is and has reactions one way or another. But eventually, If we named a building, and I'm just pulling this because it's a St. Louis name, if we named a building Dred Scott Hall,
Mm-hmm.
eventually it would just be Scott.
And so it loses some of its meaning.
Right.
Yeah.
So
what are your thoughts around how to keep these stories alive, and maybe tell us some of the stories that you've learned and uncovered?
Here's my favorite story. My absolute favorite story is that there was a Jesuit who came to visit these enslaved people who were working at SLU in I think somewhere in the 1830s. And he heard them calling, I think it was Father Van Quickenborn, Napoleon. And for some reason, he read that as a compliment. I hear that and I just chuckle because I'm thinking, knowing Black people the way I know Black people, that is not a compliment.
They're probably playing the dozens.
Playing the dozens. And it suggests also that they were very aware of Haiti and Toussaint.
Yes. So
Right.
for those who don't know the history.
Toussaint and the Haitians, the only successful enslaved nation of Black people to kick out their enslavers. A 10-year revolution, they won and kicked them out. Now, the world has been treating Haiti like crap since then, but if you know who Napoleon is in 1823 as an enslaved Black person, it stretches the imagination to believe that they only knew Napoleon and didn't know Toussaint.
Exactly. And that also pushes, even in that short story that's about maybe them making fun of the Jesuit, tells us and pushes us to remember that these are full people, because so often the caricature is, they don't know how to read or write.
Exactly.
They aren't educated.
Exactly.
Well, they certainly knew what was going on in the world.
Right. And so again, you begin to fully humanize people. So I actually had this conversation in my class yesterday. We've been talking about, Tuesday we were actually talking about the Haitian Revolution and talking about how the passage of news, that you begin to listen to how people talked, how enslaved people talked and what they communicated to each other. You would have to let go of some of your ideas about illiteracy in slave communities, right? So we always talk about the illiteracy and the exceptionality of literacy among enslaved people, but there's never, at a certain point in U.S. history, there's complete disincentive for enslaved people to admit to or demonstrate literacy.
Why would they want to
Why would you ever do that?
let them know you can do that?
Yeah, if I'm still living in that society and you ask me if I can read, what? No.
Why do you need to know that?
No, I don't even ask why you need to know that.
No, in my head, I'm thinking like, I'm not gonna tell you that.
Right. It's like, I'm not going to tell you that. And I don't even ask why do you need to know that? Because I know their need to know is a need to keep me
in my
subjugated.
Place. Yes.
So it's not even, it's like, I know what you're asking. I know why you're asking. And there's never going to be a moment where I say, yes, would you like me to take some notes for you?
Mm-mm.
Just never. And you read something like you read Frederick Douglass's narrative, you hear how he engaged in this, this mischievous scam with these young white boys to get them to teach him to read.
That's right.
Right. So if you uncover these stories, you tell a story like that, it begins to let you know that there's just a lot going on. And in that moment, if you see these slaves, you see enslaved people laughing. If you give them full humanity, they're not laughing because they're happy with their condition. They're laughing because this dude thinks Napoleon is a compliment.
Right. And that has power to potentially shift the current narratives that we have about Black people.
Yes.
If we can shift and challenge people to have a more full narrative, perhaps they can push and shift their current narrative. Because so many people have that sort of, lazy, happy-darky, zip coon, all these all these caricatures.
So we talked about this, and I think if you look at Robin Kelly's Race Rebels, and you begin to think about, so Robin Kelly's Race Rebels, one of the things he talks about are like the ordinary ways that Black people resisted slavery on a day-to-day basis. So you break tools. You break tools, you misunderstand instructions, you call in sick to work, and you do work slowdowns. So now if you're an enslaved person, if you're an enslaver who doesn't understand that as resistance, you think that Black people are incompetent, lazy, unproductive.
When in reality,
all of those are structures of resistance.
So completely reframing what we
what we think we know about Black people and enslaved Black people and the work that they did.
And what's fascinating to me is I always like to ask, like, who does it benefit for these stories to remain, and who does it benefit for new ways of thinking to emerge? And one of the things in Raising Equity is I hope that people help young people understand themselves and others. So, right, like understanding the fullness of who people are and who they are, but to be able to see the larger systems and to step into dismantling them, but really transforming them and creating something new.
Right.
And what's exciting in what you're saying is that if we can do a better job as a society, right? So yes, this is a project that SLU is doing, but what you're pushing us to say is that this system, this was the way that our economy was set up. So we all are complicit, right? So if we can push ourselves to like reframe the stories and the richness and the fullness of the lives of people who were enslaved,
right?
We can see them in their full humanity and understand how it benefited the status quo for the story to be that they're lazy rather than the story to be that they are smart enough to have work slowdowns and organize.
Well, and even that it's like the status quo thinks it benefits them. And it doesn't. Right.
Say more.
Because if it's a work slowdown and you're breaking, it literally does not benefit them. It literally costs them.
True.
It costs them every day. Right. So by not telling these stories, by not uncovering everything there is to know, it benefits no one to keep these stories untold. Right. And so there's a fear. So if we can get segments of our white population out of the fear that telling these stories, just kind of amps up their need to apologize and shed tears. It's like, no, these stories help us to fully understand how systems work.
That's beautiful.
They help us understand fully how they work, because if we don't tell them, we don't fully know how the entire system works.
Right. And like you said, you could be left thinking that it benefits
right
white folks in particular, right? But it really doesn't. And that's something that I often share with folks nowadays. It's like this equity, all the buzzwords, all this work, it's not about you doing for others. It's about you doing for yourself, the community that you live in, to make it a place where everyone can be educated and is treated with respect and has those same unearned privileges you do.
Right.
So that you can live a fuller life.
Right. Yeah. Like, who loses if everybody gets treated with respect?
And those are those unearned entitlements, those privileges that those aren't the conferred dominance, the ones that we want to, stop. Those unearned entitlements, they're not like pie. Everyone can have it.
You're right. Everyone can have it. And we just need to do much more work in terms of telling these stories, telling truths, whether they're and I think get rid of the notion that some are uncomfortable, that there's dirty laundry and, here's the good story, here's the dirty laundry. Because for me, and again, all of the descendants that we've contacted don't feel the same way about it, to be clear.
I can imagine.
There's some who are like, not interested in reconciliation, not interested in doing anything for you around this. And there are others who have expressed appreciation around the work that we've been able to do in terms of giving them family stories, access to documents that help them complete a narrative that they didn't have before. But it's not a monolithic response.
It's not. Well, I really appreciate you sharing. It has helped me understand the project in a different way and helped me think about how humanizing the stories of enslaved people, which has always been something that I've sought to do in the readings that I do, but how that actually helps us potentially shift our narratives of today.
Yep.
So thank you so much. If folks want to learn more about the project, learn more about you, how would they find that out?
So how they can find that out for the project specifically, you can go to shmr.jesuits.org. And so there you can find information about the project. You can find out some more specific stories about individuals who we've uncovered some stories for. It's also a place, if you know of descendants or think you might be descendant, it's a place to go to help us complete those connections. Because again, that's just ongoing work. And for me, look for diversity and community engagement on the St. Louis University website.
Yeah. Or do you have a Twitter handle or Instagram handle you'd want people to follow? If not, no worries. You can pass.
I have. So actually, for a lot of this work, I have a Prof. J.C. Smith _SLU is my Twitter handle.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
And thank you all for joining me on Raising Equity. Definitely check out the website. They have family names, and you might know someone who's a descendant. And I know for me, when we did our family history, we hit that 1870 wall. That was the first time that we could see a record of people in our family. And to have that wall broken down by an institution holding itself accountable to its legacy, I think is an exciting thing. So I think that this project is a beautiful example of how people and institutions are grappling with what to do. And I hope that the framing that Jonathan gave us will help you also reframe the importance of humanizing people who were enslaved and complicating what we think we know about the system of slavery. Join us next time on Raising Equity.